I thought I had vanished from their lives after 3 years of silence. Then, one afternoon at Newport Harbor, I boarded my yacht and found my mother wiping a wine glass with my embroidered towel. My father skipped the greetings. He stared straight at me and issued a command. Sell the yacht. Get cash. Tonight. They had no idea this vessel was never my dream. It was the trap I prepared the day they erased me. My name is Stella Turner. For over 1,000 days, I had cultivated a life of complete and absolute silence, building my own empire on the salt water and steel of the commercial marine industry. I stepped off the concrete dock and onto the polished teak deck of my vessel after a grueling 14-hour shift, the damp chill of the evening breeze clinging heavy to my jacket. The harbor was relatively quiet, bathed in the amber and silver glow of the security lights reflecting off the dark water. But the moment my hand touched the cold, stainless steel handle of the main salon door, the fragile illusion of my peaceful sanctuary shattered into jagged pieces. Through the heavy tinted glass, I could see the interior lights were blazing with maximum intensity. Someone had turned the climate control up to a suffocating 72 degrees. I pushed the heavy door open, the airtight seal releasing with a soft, mechanical hiss, and stepped directly into my own private nightmare. They had commandeered the space exactly like invading royalty. My father, Calvin Turner, was seated directly at the helm station. He wore a pristine, crisp white linen shirt that screamed of country clubs and inherited, unearned arrogance. He sat perfectly straight in the captain's-style leather chair, a seat specifically designated for the master of the vessel. Despite the fact that he did not possess a single ounce of authority or the basic knowledge required to even start the twin diesel engines, he looked completely and utterly at home, his manicured hands resting confidently on the polished mahogany console as if he owned the very air in the room. Across the salon, my mother, Lorraine, was busy raiding the custom-built, climate-controlled liquor cabinet. She did not even flinch or turn around when I entered her line of sight. Her fingers bypassed the standard commercial spirits and went straight for a bottle of 25-year-old single malt scotch, handling the expensive glass with the practiced, terrifying ease of a woman who genuinely believed she deserved the most valuable item in any room she ever walked into. She picked up a white towel to wipe the glass, and I felt a sharp twist in my gut. It was my towel, the one with my initials meticulously embroidered on the edge. Standing awkwardly near the galley, trying to make himself invisible, was Evan, one of my junior deckhands. He was barely 22 years old, a hard-working kid from the local community college, and right now, his face was the color of wet chalk. His hands visibly trembled as he clutched a polishing cloth against his chest. When he finally saw me standing in the doorway, his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Miss Turner," Evan stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "I am so incredibly sorry. They came aboard about an hour ago. They told me they were your family. They told me they wanted to surprise you. And the gentleman sitting there told me that if I ruined the family surprise, he would make a few phone calls and ensure I never found work in this harbor, or any other harbor on the coast, ever again." I looked slowly at Calvin. He did not deny the threat. He did not even look at the terrified young man. He simply stared at me, his face an unreadable, hardened mask of cold authority. I turned my attention back to my deckhand, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level and completely devoid of the violent rage that was beginning to boil rapidly in my chest. "It is perfectly fine, Evan," I said, stepping fully into the salon and letting the heavy door click securely shut behind me. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. Pack up your gear and go home for the night. You are on paid leave until tomorrow afternoon. Get off the boat." Evan swallowed hard, nodding vigorously before practically sprinting past me and out into the cool night air. The heavy, desperate thud of his footsteps on the dock faded quickly into the distance. We were finally alone. From the deep shadows of the port-side lounge area, a slow, highly sarcastic, rhythmic clapping echoed through the tense room. My older brother, Grant Turner, was sprawled out on the custom Italian leather sofa, his expensive designer shoes resting carelessly on the fragile edge of the glass coffee table. He wore a tailored suit jacket over a casual shirt, a look that desperately tried to convey effortless success, but only served to highlight his underlying, unshaven exhaustion. He stopped clapping and flashed his signature, half-cocked smirk. "Nice yacht. Stella," Grant said, his tone dripping with a toxic, condescending mix of envy and mockery. "It is very sleek, very modern, a bit cold, exactly like you." I completely ignored his childish bait. My eyes swept methodically over the three of them, taking in the sheer, unbelievable audacity of their physical presence. 3 years of absolute, punishing radio silence, no phone calls, no holiday cards, not a single, solitary text message to see if I was surviving or starving. And now, they were here, occupying my space, drinking my premium liquor, and terrorizing my hired staff. "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the sharp, unforgiving edge of a razor blade. "All of you, right now." Calvin finally moved. He slowly and deliberately rotated the captain's chair to face me fully. He steepled his fingers together, his expression entirely devoid of paternal warmth, regret, or even basic human courtesy. "Family does not need appointments. Stella," Calvin stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that used to make me freeze in my tracks when I was a terrified child. "Family just needs assets. And clearly, looking around this floating palace, you have acquired plenty of them while completely neglecting your own blood." I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, refusing to let him see the sudden, dangerous spike in my heart rate. "This is a registered commercial vessel. You are currently trespassing on a corporate asset. I will give you exactly 2 minutes to walk off my deck before I call harbor security and have you physically removed." Lorraine finally turned around, the heavy crystal tumbler of amber scotch secured tightly in her hand. She wore an expression of deeply wounded grace, an emotional mask perfectly manufactured for this exact occasion. "Do not be so terribly dramatic, Stella," Lorraine sighed heavily, taking a delicate, lingering sip of the expensive liquid. "We did not come all this way to fight with you. Your younger brother is in a terrible situation, a truly awful, life-ruining bind. You have all of this excessive luxury. You have a moral obligation to save him." I looked at Grant again. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a twitching jaw and a desperate, hungry, feral look in his bloodshot eyes. He was not just visiting, he was drowning, and I was the convenient life raft they had unilaterally decided to hijack. "I do not care about his situation," I replied flatly, stripping all emotion from my voice. "I am not a bank, and I am certainly not your bank." Calvin stood up abruptly. He smoothed the front of his expensive linen shirt and walked slowly, deliberately toward me. The spacious salon suddenly felt incredibly small and suffocating. He stopped just 2 feet away, using his imposing height to cast a dark shadow over my face. "We are not asking for a loan," Calvin said, his tone entirely dropping the thin pretense of a negotiation. "We are telling you exactly what is going to happen. I need cash. I need it tonight. No wire transfers, no bank drafts, no corporate checks that can be traced. I want hard currency." I stared right back at him, forcing myself to hold his aggressive gaze without blinking. I looked slightly past his broad shoulder, taking in the gleaming, organized interior of the salon, the rich wood, the high-end navigation electronics, the meticulously organized filing cabinets bolted securely to the bulkhead. I felt a sudden, profound, structural shift in my perspective. They looked at this vessel and saw a floating piggy bank, a symbol of frivolous, unearned wealth they felt completely entitled to raid and destroy. They thought this was a silly vanity project of a rebellious daughter. They had absolutely no idea. This yacht was not a luxury item. It was my fortress. It was the physical, legal manifestation of my hard-won independence, built solidly on ironclad contracts, meticulous accounting, and ruthless corporate boundaries. It was the exact place where their emotional manipulation and historical abuse held absolutely zero weight. If I played this delicate game correctly, the very asset they came to exploit would be the steel jaws of the trap that finally snapped shut on them. Calvin leaned in closer, invading my personal space. I could smell the faint, bitter trace of peppermint and stale coffee masking something sour on his breath. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, stripping away the last, pathetic remnants of the father I once knew, leaving only a desperate creditor demanding a pound of flesh. "You owe us 3 years, Stella," Calvin whispered, his voice cold, heavy, and dripping with absolute, unshakable entitlement. "Now pay." My gaze drifted past Calvin's broad shoulders and locked onto the narrow hallway leading down to the lower residential deck. The sheer, overwhelming volume of their physical intrusions suddenly became undeniably clear. 3 massive, hard-shell designer suitcases were aggressively stacked against the polished teak bulkheads, effectively barricading the companionway. They had not just dropped by to demand a quick ransom. They had packed for a prolonged, indefinite occupation. Moving my eyes toward the main dining area, the tight knot in my stomach hardened into a cold stone. The custom-built mahogany table, a space I kept meticulously bare for reviewing maritime contracts and spreading out charter itineraries, had been entirely hijacked. Lorraine had unzipped 2 oversized leather cosmetic cases, carelessly spilling a chaotic, sprawling arsenal of glass serum bottles, jade rollers, and silver-handled brushes across the pristine, varnished wood. It was a perfectly calculated mess. She was not simply unpacking after a long drive. She was physically marking her territory. She was laying down her scent like a predator claiming a newly conquered den. The heavy, suffocating floral stench of her signature perfume was already overpowering the natural, crisp scent of the ocean that usually filled my cabin. Calvin noticed the precise direction of my stare. He did not offer a single word of apology for the sprawling, disrespectful mess. Instead, he simply issued his next directive with the casual, infuriating arrogance of a king rearranging his peasants. "You will need to clear your personal belongings out of the master stateroom downstairs," Calvin announced, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. "Grant is completely exhausted. His nerves are entirely shot. He needs the primary suite to get some decent, uninterrupted rest. You can move your things into that tiny starboard twin bunk. It should be more than enough space for you to sleep." He waved his hand dismissively toward the lower deck, completely ignoring the sheer absurdity of the situation. He was ordering the owner and captain of the vessel out of her own private quarters. It was a blatant, deliberate flex of dominance, a psychological tactic designed to instantly reduce me back to the role of a subordinate child living under his absolute rule. I walked slowly toward the helm station to put some physical distance between us, my heavy work boots making soft thuds against the carpet. As I passed my designated navigation and administrative desk, the blood in my veins ran instantly cold. The physical invasion extended far beyond cumbersome luggage and scattered makeup. The brass lock on my lower filing drawer, the specific drawer holding my sensitive corporate tax returns and vendor agreements, bore fresh, jagged silver scratches. Someone had taken a sharp metal tool to it, desperately and clumsily trying to jimmy it open. I glanced quickly to my right. The digital keypad on the concealed mini-safe bolted to the bulkhead was glowing with a harsh, flashing red error code. This meant someone had repeatedly punched in the wrong access sequence until the internal security system locked them out entirely. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone to check my internal security feed, only to find my device completely disconnected from the local network. A quick search of the available connections revealed the ugly truth. The default name of my onboard Wi-Fi had been altered, and the administrative password forcibly reset. This was not a chaotic, emotional family visit born out of desperation. This was a systematic, highly calculated strip mining operation. They were actively searching for my vulnerabilities, my bank account numbers, my financial leverage. They wanted to know exactly how much they could bleed out of me. A sudden, frantic hissing sound drew my attention toward the aft sliding glass doors. Grant was huddled tightly in the corner, his back turned to the open room. His phone was pressed so forcefully against his ear that his knuckles were stark white. His entire body language was composed of raw, vibrating panic. "Listen to me," Grant whispered into the receiver, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate edge that echoed slightly in the quiet corner. "If I do not have the money by tonight, they are going to come here, I am telling you. They know exactly where I am. Yes, tonight." He abruptly ended the call, his shoulders slumping heavily as if he were suddenly carrying a massive physical weight. Calvin intercepted my gaze, smoothly stepping into my line of sight to capitalize on his son's obvious terror. 18 years, Stella," Calvin said smoothly, adopting the perfectly rehearsed tone of a disappointed, long-suffering patriarch. "We put a solid roof over your head, fed you, and clothed you for 18 long years. We gave you everything you needed to survive. You owe us this debt. It is time to pay it back." Lorraine immediately chimed in from the salon couch, expertly blending deep maternal guilt with a vicious, cutting command. "Do not be a heartless, cruel sister," she scolded, her eyes narrowing sharply as she pointed a manicured finger in my direction. "Do you truly want to see your own flesh and blood locked away in a federal prison? Are you really going to stand there and let your brother be completely destroyed over your own selfish pride?" I kept my facial expression completely blank, refusing to give them the emotional reaction, the anger, or the tears they were so desperately trying to provoke. "This vessel is an active commercial operation," I stated calmly, my voice perfectly echoing the sterile, unyielding language of a corporate policy manual. "It is strictly governed by commercial maritime insurance and harbor security regulations. Unauthorized personnel are strictly prohibited from remaining on board overnight. You cannot stay here." Calvin threw his head back and let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. The sound was incredibly harsh and entirely out of place in the elegant, enclosed space. "You think some corporate paperwork and a fancy boat make you a grown woman?" he mocked, shaking his head with profound, condescending amusement. "You think these little rules make you untouchable? You think you can give me orders? You are still my child, and you will do exactly what you are told." The air in the salon suddenly felt thick, heavy, and completely unbreathable. The suffocating weight of their shared delusion was pressing in on me from all sides, threatening to crush the peace I had spent over 1,000 days building. I turned my back to them, my hand finding the heavy metal latch of the aft door. I slid the thick glass open and stepped out onto the open deck, letting the heavy door slide firmly shut behind me, sealing them inside. The cold, biting sea breeze hit my face instantly, clearing the phantom stench of Lorraine's perfume from my lungs. I gripped the cold stainless steel railing, staring out at the dark, rippling water of the harbor. I drew a deep, steadying breath, filling my chest with the sharp bite of salt and the faint tang of fuel on the wind. And right then, quietly, cleanly, I made a vow that felt unbreakable. I would not argue with them. Arguing was a form of engagement. Arguing meant stepping onto their stage and accepting the role they'd already written for me in their warped little family drama. I wouldn't give them a single word of defiance. Instead, I would give them space, just enough, to show everyone exactly who they were. The crisp, biting salt air in my lungs became a brutal kind of anchor, yanking me out of the suffocating heat of the salon and dropping me into the cold, undeniable truth of my own history, out here in the dark, with the waves keeping time against the hull. My mind replayed an exact, agonizing moment, the day my existence was methodically erased from the Turner family ledger, as if I'd never belonged there at all, 3 years ago. The silence began. It wasn't a slow, natural drifting apart. It was deliberate. It was surgical. It was a brutal, overnight severing, an emotional execution. My phone calls stopped ringing through and went directly to an automated voicemail. The final Thursday of November arrived, with no invitation to the grand dining room, leaving me to eat a solitary, heavily processed dinner in a cramped, poorly heated studio apartment. December rolled in, and my small metal mailbox remained entirely empty, devoid of the glossy, heavily embossed holiday cards they sent to absolutely everyone else, including their casual business acquaintances and the people who landscaped their front lawn. I was entirely scrubbed from their narrative, treated exactly as if I had never taken a single breath on this earth. The official story, the highly sanitized version they undoubtedly spun to concerned relatives and nosy country club friends, was that I was a profoundly selfish, unsupportive daughter. My older brother had pitched a supposedly revolutionary green energy investment project. He needed a massive, immediate injection of capital and boldly demanded that I act as his primary financial guarantor to secure his high-risk loans. When I firmly, unequivocally refused to sign the legally binding documents that would tie my future to his reckless ambition, my parents immediately painted me as the bitter villain who actively wanted to see her own flesh and blood fail miserably. But my refusal was merely the surface fracture. The true catastrophic explosion had occurred exactly 3 weeks prior to that argument. During a routine visit to a local car dealership, I had been attempting to secure a modest, reliable lease for a commuter sedan. The seasoned finance manager had returned to his desk, sliding my printed credit report across the polished wood with a look of genuine, uncomfortable pity. There, glaring at me in stark black ink, was a massive, heavily defaulted line of credit. It had been aggressively drawn upon for over 48 months. It had been opened using my social security number, my middle name, and my parents' exact residential address. They had covertly hijacked my financial identity to silently float grants previous. Disastrous business failures and maintain their own extravagant standard of living. My once immaculate credit score was thoroughly decimated. Plunging disastrously into the low 500s, I did not scream. I did not throw objects across the room. I did not even file a formal police report for identity theft. A lingering shred of pathetic, daughterly weakness that I still deeply and fiercely regret to this day. Instead, I simply vanished from their jurisdiction. I changed my personal phone number within 24 hours. I packed my meager belongings into 3 cardboard boxes, broke my residential lease, and moved far away to a rough, industrial coastal town where nobody knew or cared about the Turner family legacy. I started over at the absolute, grueling bottom. I worked brutally long, back-breaking shifts on the commercial docks. I spent countless days hauling thick, saltwater-soaked mooring lines, scraping heavy barnacles off commercial hulls, and learning the punishing, unforgiving reality of deep-water marine operations. I traded my tailored corporate suits for heavy canvas work jackets, thermal layers, and scuffed steel-toed boots. I bled, I sweat, and I silently built a fortress out of my own isolation, slowly and meticulously. I transformed that raw, calloused experience into a legitimate enterprise. I established Seawick Marine Logistics from the ground up. It was not a glamorous, high-society venture. We handled the gritty, complex, logistical nightmares of coastal freight transport. We coordinated highly intricate scheduling for massive commercial vessels and managed exclusive port operations for ultra-high net worth clients who demanded absolute, flawless execution without excuses. I built an ironclad reputation for total reliability in an industry that chewed up the weak. This vessel, the very yacht my family was currently treating like a stolen resort hotel, was purchased entirely through my corporate entity. It was not a frivolous toy or a desperate cry for attention. It was a highly calculated, heavily depreciated business asset. It functioned as my mobile, highly secure floating boardroom. It was the exact place where I hosted international clients, negotiated massive maritime logistics contracts, and secured operational deals that spanned the entire western seaboard. Every inch of custom teak and polished stainless steel was a legitimate, tax-deductible tool designed to project ultimate financial stability and absolute competence to my partners. Yet, as I stared out at the dark harbor, the memory of my final, devastating confrontation with my father flared sharply in my mind. I had driven to their immaculate, sprawling suburban home, tightly clutching the damning, multi-page credit report in my shaking hand. I had demanded a simple explanation for the stolen identity and the ruined financial foundation. Calvin had looked at me not with an ounce of paternal guilt, but with intense, blazing annoyance at the interruption. He had casually adjusted his heavy gold watch, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered his final, crushing verdict. He told me I was entirely ungrateful for the life he had provided. He stated, with absolute conviction, that I was only good at putting on a dramatic show, completely incapable of understanding the heavy, necessary burdens of maintaining a family's reputation. Then, he simply stepped back and slammed the heavy oak front door directly in my face. The heavy thud of the latch catching was as final as a judge dropping a heavy wooden gavel. Echoing softly behind that slamming door was the chilling, that transactional rule my mother had casually dropped during a catered dinner party several years earlier. It was a single sentence that perfectly summarized the entirely transactional nature of my childhood. She had smiled pleasantly over her crystal wine glass and stated that a person is not truly family if they are not actively useful to the household. I blinked hard against the harsh, amber glow of the harbor security lights, pulling myself violently out of the suffocating past and back into the freezing, high-stakes present. They had deemed me useless 3 years ago and discarded me without a second thought. Now, they had somehow tracked down my hard-won success and decided I was useful once again. I tightened my grip on the cold metal railing until my knuckles ached. Standing completely alone in the dark, surrounded by the empire I built with my own 2 hands, I renewed the sacred, unbreakable vow I had made on the exact day I changed my phone number. If they ever found me, if they ever came crawling back onto my territory to demand my money or my blood, I would not pay them with a single drop of emotion. I would not offer them the satisfaction of my anger, the vulnerability of my tears, or the weakness of my forgiveness. I would only pay them with legally binding, completely merciless contracts. I pushed the heavy sliding door open and stepped back into the suffocating climate-controlled air of the main salon. The brief respite of the ocean wind was immediately replaced by the heavy tension radiating from the 3 people currently occupying my space. My older brother had moved from the leather sofa and was now pacing a tight, frantic circle near the galley island. The harsh overhead lighting exposed the severe physical toll his current predicament had exacted. Deep, bruised shadows hung heavily under his bloodshot eyes, suggesting he had not slept a single hour in several days. His hands, usually so steady when holding a crystal glass at a country club, were shaking so violently that he had to tightly grip the edge of the marble countertop to stabilize himself. Every few seconds, his head snapped toward the tinted windows, his eyes darting frantically as if he fully expected an armed tactical team to breach the hull at any given moment. I walked to the center of the room. Folding my arms, I looked directly at the man who called himself my father. I asked him to explain exactly what kind of catastrophic failure required an impromptu midnight raid on my commercial vessel. Calvin cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to project an aura of unfortunate but manageable business turbulence. He launched into a carefully rehearsed narrative. He explained that Grant had secured a highly aggressive, short-term influx of capital from a private, unlisted investor group to keep his failing green energy initiative afloat. According to the story, the terms were predatory, the deadlines were completely unforgiving, and Grant had missed a critical balloon payment. Now, this shadowy syndicate was threatening severe physical repercussions if the outstanding balance was not settled before the sun came up. I did not nod. I did not offer a single word of sisterly concern. I simply extended my right hand, palm facing upward, and demanded to see the official documentation. Calvin hesitated for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of profound annoyance flashing across his hardened features. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his linen jacket and withdrew a thick, tri-folded sheet of heavy bond paper. He slapped it onto the glass coffee table and slid it toward me. I picked it up and scanned the aggressive, bald letterhead. It read, Northwind Capital Solutions. There was no listed corporate address, Only a generic post office box located in a barren industrial sector of Nevada. The document was titled as an immediate notice of default and intent to accelerate collection. The numbers printed below the legal jargon were staggering, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars in principal, compounded by exorbitant daily penalty fees. Before I could even finish reading the second paragraph, Lorraine launched her next emotional offensive. She leaned forward on the sofa, clutching her expensive silk scarf tightly against her chest. She painted a vivid, horrific picture of Grant being dragged into a brutal criminal underworld, his entire promising future completely incinerated. She asked me, her voice trembling with manufactured tears, if I was truly prepared to let my own brother be violently destroyed while I sat comfortably on my pristine, floating sanctuary. I ignored her theatrical performance entirely and returned my focus to the paperwork. I asked Calvin why they needed untraceable currency instead of a standard corporate wire transfer, which could instantly satisfy any legitimate financial institution within 24 hours. Calvin immediately leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He claimed that wiring funds would trigger automated banking flags, potentially leading to immediate account freezes. He stated that these particular private lenders operated strictly outside the traditional banking system and required hard currency to wipe the slate clean without leaving a digital paper trail for federal auditors. As he spoke, a chilling realization began to creep up my spine. I listened closely to the specific vocabulary Calvin was utilizing. He was speaking with terrifying fluency about asset seizure protocols, collateral liquidation triggers, and the exact legal mechanisms of rapid debt recovery. He was describing the intricate, brutal anatomy of a financial execution, not like a concerned father relaying his foolish son's mistakes, but like a seasoned veteran who had intimate, first-hand experience with this exact type of corporate slaughter. He was entirely too comfortable with the predatory mechanics of the situation. I opened my mouth to press him on these highly specific legal terms, but Grant suddenly shattered the tense silence. He pushed himself away from the marble counter, his voice rising to a sharp, hysterical pitch. He yelled that I did not understand the severity of the situation. He threw his hands in the air and blindly shouted that the men from Northwind had already made their move. He blurted out, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that they had explicitly told him the house was no longer their house. The entire room instantly froze. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening. Calvin shot a lethal, silencing glare at his son, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles visibly bulged. Lorraine physically recoiled, her hand flying to cover her mouth as if she could stuff the damaging words back into Grant's throat. My mind raced. Slamming the disjointed puzzle pieces together with brutal efficiency, the 3 massive hard-shell suitcases barricading the hallway, the frantic attempt to break into my secure filing cabinets, the demand to commandeer the master stateroom, the incredibly detailed knowledge of asset seizure. This was not merely a desperate rescue mission for a wayward son. The toxic, suffocating rot of this massive financial failure had spread far beyond Grant's personal accounts. This catastrophic debt was actively swallowing the entire Turner family empire. The sprawling, immaculate suburban home they prized above all else was clearly already on the chopping block. They were not here to visit. They were not here to borrow. They were running from the very real consequences of their actions. And they fully intended to use my corporate assets, my clean financial record, and my physical sanctuary to shield themselves from the incoming blast radius. If I simply handed over a bag of untraceable currency, I would be legally implicating my own pristine corporation in their fraudulent, sinking ship. I would be dragged straight down into the dark abyss with them. I carefully folded the Northwind Capital Solutions document and placed it gently back onto the glass table. I smoothed my jacket, ensuring my posture was absolutely rigid and my facial expression remained a perfect, unreadable mask of corporate compliance. I looked at the 3 desperate strangers occupying my salon, fully recognizing the incredible danger they posed to my survival. I took a slow, measured breath and delivered the exact words they were so desperately praying to hear, setting the stage for the absolute destruction of their unearned arrogance. "All right," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any underlying threat. "I will take care of this situation and secure the necessary funds, but if I am financing this rescue, it will be executed entirely through my legal channels, strictly on my terms." I turned on my heel and walked out of the main salon. Ensuring my posture betrayed absolutely nothing but tired compliance, I moved deliberately up the short, steep flight of teak stairs leading directly to the elevated pilot house. Once inside the darkened bridge, I pushed the heavy, reinforced security door shut and aggressively threw the solid steel deadbolt. The loud metallic clack of the locking mechanism echoed sharply in the small, instrument-filled space. I leaned my entire body weight against the cold bulkhead, closed my eyes tightly, and allowed myself exactly 120 seconds to physically process the violent surge of adrenaline. My heart was hammering fiercely against my ribs, a primal, uncontrollable biological response to the sudden, traumatic invasion of my designated safe haven. I forced my breathing to slow, inhaling deeply through my nose and exhaling a long, steady stream of air through my mouth. The terrified, discarded daughter was officially banished from the room. The chief executive officer of Seawick Marine Logistics stepped forward to take the helm. I was no longer a victim trapped in a family dispute. I was a corporate entity dealing with a hostile threat on my property. I pulled my encrypted secondary smartphone from my inner jacket pocket. There was exactly one person in my entire extended bloodline who had never been drained by the toxic, parasitic vortex of my parents. I dialed the private number for Darlene Hart. She was my mother's younger sister, but they were separated by an absolute canyon of personality, intellect, and morality. Darlene was a retired, utterly ruthless corporate transaction attorney. She had spent 35 years tearing apart hostile takeovers, structuring complex acquisitions, and crushing predatory mergers in the high-stakes financial districts of Chicago. She had seen through Calvin's empty charm decades ago and had wisely kept her distance. The line rang exactly twice before the connection opened. There were no soft greetings, no concerned questions about my emotional well-being, and absolutely no trivial small talk. She knew I would only call this secure line if the situation was critical. "Send me a high-resolution photograph of the exact document they placed in front of you," Darlene commanded, her voice a dry, raspy bark honed by decades of dominating mahogany boardroom tables. "Do it right this second." I did not waste a single syllable on an explanation. I opened my encrypted file vault during the chaotic confrontation downstairs, while pretending to carefully read the Northwind Capital Solutions notice. I had subtly activated my pocket scanner application and captured a flawless image of the paperwork. I transmitted the digital file directly to her secure offshore server. I stood in the dim, ambient green glow of the navigation monitors, listening to the rapid, aggressive clacking of Darlene's mechanical keyboard over the speakerphone. Less than 90 seconds later, she let out a sharp, entirely humorless sound that resembled a dry cough. "Northwind Capital Solutions is absolutely not a private investor syndicate," Darlene stated flatly, stripping away Calvin's grand, terrifying illusion with clinical, surgical precision. "They do not fund revolutionary green energy startups. They do not fund anything at all. They are a highly aggressive, bottom-feeding debt collection shell company. They purchase distressed, severely delinquent loans for literal pennies on the dollar. Then, they deploy psychological terrorism against wealthy, status-obsessed families to force an immediate, massive payout. They rely entirely on panic, intimidation, and the desperate fear of public embarrassment to extract exorbitant late fees and unreasonable penalties." I relayed Calvin's strict, non-negotiable demand for physical, untraceable currency to be delivered by midnight, detailing his paranoid excuse about automated banking flags and frozen accounts. The silence on the other end of the line grew thick with intense professional disgust. "They desperately want you to make a catastrophic tactical error," Darlene growled, the anger vibrating clearly through the speaker. Handing over physical currency is the exact mechanism they use to ensure you possess absolutely no legal proof of the transaction. If you pay a third-party debt with cash, you do not become the lien holder. You do not secure any legal rights of subrogation. You simply vaporize your own liquidity. When Northwind decides they want more money next month, or when Calvin decides to deny you ever helped them, you will have zero paper trail to prove you already satisfied the principal balance. Your father knows this perfectly well. He is actively trying to insulate himself while leaving you completely exposed to the financial fallout. I paced the narrow width of the pilot house, my boots entirely silent on the rubberized floor matting. "There is another variable," I said, my voice hardening into solid ice as the strategic picture became clear. Calvin was speaking with total, unnatural fluency about asset seizure protocols and collateral liquidation triggers. If this was strictly Grant's isolated business failure, Calvin would be furious. But he would not be this clinically desperate. He would simply cut Grant off and protect his own assets. "Precisely," Darlene confirmed, her tone dropping into a deadly serious register. "The fact that Calvin is demanding untraceable funds and artificially rushing the timeline means he is legally tethered directly to the blast radius. He must have signed a personal guarantee to secure Grant's initial funding. He likely leveraged a major shared asset to appease these collectors before they accelerated the default. He is not trying to save your brother. He is trying to save himself." The image of the 3 massive suitcases blocking my lower hallway flashed brightly in my mind, followed immediately by Grant's hysterical, desperate confession about the house no longer belonging to them. The disparate pieces finally locked together into a terrifying, yet highly exploitable, legal structure. They were already completely underwater. "So we do not pay the debt," I declared, my mind racing through the potential corporate maneuvers. "If I simply hand them a financial lifeline, they will drag me down into the abyss the exact moment they slip again." "Exactly," Darlene said, the fierce pride evident in her sharp tone. "We do not pay off their liability. We acquire the absolute control of the entire situation through a highly structured, legally binding transaction. We execute a commercial maneuver. We rapidly outline the tactical parameters of our counteroffensive. I needed to pivot my behavior immediately. I needed to walk back down those stairs and offer them exactly what they craved, the comforting illusion of total, unquestioned victory. I would swallow my pride, lower my eyes, and play the role of the obedient, deeply intimidated daughter who had finally recognized her inherent duty to the family legacy. I would let Calvin feel incredibly smart and powerful. I would make Lorraine feel successfully manipulative. I would make them feel completely and utterly comfortable, so entirely secure in their dominance that they would eagerly and voluntarily step right into a legally inescapable snare of their own making. I thanked my aunt, the strategic blueprint now firmly locked into my mind. I was no longer reacting to a chaotic emotional ambush. I was initiating a hostile takeover of my own family's disastrous liabilities. Before she disconnected the secure call, Darlene delivered a final chilling piece of advice that bypassed my logic and settled deep into my bones, perfectly aligning with the cold ocean air outside the thick glass windows. "Remember your training, Stella," Darlene whispered softly, her words carrying the heavy weight of absolute certainty. "You do not need to win this fight by screaming at them. You win with a signature in the exact right place." I remained perfectly still in the dimly lit pilot house, waiting. Exactly 14 minutes later, my encrypted smartphone vibrated against my palm. Darlene possessed an absolutely terrifying network of former associates buried deep within the underbelly of corporate underwriting. And she had clearly called in several major favors. The incoming message was not a text, but a highly secure, encrypted audio file. I pressed the speaker to my ear. Her raspy voice cut straight through the silence, delivering the first devastating blow. She explained that her contacts had pulled the original lien registry. Northwind Capital Solutions was indeed holding a massive toxic promissory note. However, The collateral securing this debt had absolutely nothing to do with Grant and his fabricated green energy venture. The underlying asset legally tethered to the loan was the sprawling, pristine, four-bedroom estate located in Irvine, California. It was the absolute crown jewel of my parents' manufactured kingdom. They had quietly mortgaged their own sanctuary to fuel their endless financial delusions. Then came the first twist, delivered with Darlene's signature, clinical precision. She had managed to secure a digital scan of the original deed of trust. She noted a glaring, massive anomaly on the final page of the contract. Lorraine's signature was highly irregular. It was completely lacking the aggressive, sweeping, heavy-handed loops she notoriously used on every single document she ever touched. The ink pressure was suspiciously soft and entirely hesitant. It was a blatant, undeniable forgery. I closed my eyes tightly, and a distinct, sharp memory violently surfaced from exactly 36 months ago. A stray, unassuming piece of mail had arrived at my cramped old apartment just days before I permanently changed my address. It was a standard identity and residence verification letter, originating from an obscure, out-of-state title company. I had carelessly tossed it directly into the recycling bin, assuming it was generic financial junk mail. I now realized with sickening clarity that it was the exact moment Calvin had weaponized their own marital assets. He had initiated the fraudulent loan and forged his own wife's signature, likely using my previous address as a decoy to intercept the initial fraud alerts. The audio file continued, plunging the knife even deeper. Northwind was not preparing to attack. They had already pulled the trigger. They had officially filed a formal notice of default in the Orange County Public Records. My family had been severely delinquent on their payments for 8 consecutive months. The terrifying midnight deadline for untraceable cash was an absolute. Manufactured fabrication by the collection agency. It was merely a brutal psychological squeeze tactic designed to extort tens of thousands of dollars in arbitrary penalty fees before the bank inevitably seized the property. I deleted the audio file, wiped the device cache, and unlocked the heavy steel door. I descended the teak stairs with silent, measured steps. Calvin and Lorraine were currently distracted in the main salon, arguing in harsh, hushed tones over the empty Scotch glass. I noticed Grant was missing from the room. I moved quietly down the portside corridor and found him standing over the marble basin in the guest lavatory, desperately splashing freezing water onto his pale, sweating face. I stepped inside the confined space and pulled the heavy wooden door shut, engaging the lock with a loud, definitive click. Grant violently flinched, spinning around to face me like a cornered animal. I stepped forward, invading his personal space, forcing him back against the cold mirror. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of any sisterly warmth. I told him I knew the debt was secured by the Irvine estate. I told him I knew the notice of default was already public record. His fragile, exhausted composure completely shattered. His chest heaved as he let out a pathetic, broken sob. He confessed everything in a rapid, hysterical whisper. He admitted that when his initial startup funding collapsed, Calvin had brought him a thick stack of legal documents. Calvin had explicitly instructed him to sign as the primary corporate borrower, utilizing the family home as the ultimate leverage. Grant's voice cracked horribly as he repeated our father's exact, damning words. He said Calvin stood over him, pointed at the dotted line, and commanded him to just sign the paper because the house belonged to Calvin anyway, and he possessed the absolute right to do whatever he wanted with his own property. The sheer, breathtaking malice of Calvin's overarching strategy finally crystallized in my mind. He was not just trying to extract a bag of untraceable cash from me tonight. He was meticulously orchestrating a flawless, bulletproof scapegoat. If I handed over the money, he would instantly funnel it to Northwind to pay the exorbitant late fees, temporarily halting the foreclosure and effectively burning my hard-earned capital to buy himself a few more months of fake luxury. When the house inevitably fell to the auction block later this year, he would loudly proclaim to the entire extended family that I had stubbornly refused to provide enough support to save them. He fully intended to make me the architect of their ultimate ruin. He was shifting the crushing weight of his monumental failure directly onto my shoulders to protect his own fragile ego. I stepped back, leaving Grant weeping silently into a luxurious hand towel. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I unlocked the door and walked straight past the salon. Returning to the absolute isolation of the bridge, I opened my encrypted laptop, the bright screen illuminating the dark cabin. I sent a rapid, secure message back to Darlene in Chicago. We were not going to pay the debt. We were going to purchase the promissory note at a discount. We would approach Northwind Capital Solutions directly through my established corporate back channels. Predatory debt buyers fundamentally despise the grueling, expensive, and legally perilous process of contested real estate foreclosures. They vastly preferred immediate, liquid capital. We would offer to purchase the original promissory note from them tonight at a steep, aggressive discount. To completely insulate my primary logistics corporation from their toxic financial radiation, I spent the next 20 minutes rapidly filing the expedited digital paperwork required to establish a brand new, legally isolated entity. I registered it in a corporate-friendly jurisdiction under the name Turner Holdco Limited Liability Company. This was absolutely not a charitable vehicle designed to rescue my falling family. It was an impermeable, heavily armored legal vault designed strictly to hold the deed to their destruction, keeping my main company completely spotless and untouchable. I closed the laptop with a soft, satisfying click. I walked over to the thick, tinted glass windows and stared out at the dark, rippling surface of the harbor water. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, settling deep into my bones. They had completely erased my existence for 3 long, agonizing years. They had discarded me like garbage. Yet, in their arrogant desperation, they had left their undeniable fingerprints all over the legal paperwork. I descended the steep teak stairs from the pilot house, forcing my shoulders to slump heavily and my breathing to turn shallow. The physical act of stripping away my aggressive corporate armor and putting back on the fragile, worn-out skin of a defeated daughter was utterly exhausting. I rubbed my temples with my fingertips, dragging my feet slightly across the carpeted floor as I re-entered the main salon. I needed them to see a woman who had finally broken under the crushing, undeniable gravity of her family's demands. I needed to present the exact image of someone yielding to the inevitable, suffocating weight of her bloodline. Calvin and Lorraine were waiting in tense silence. Grant had dragged himself back from the lavatory, looking like a hollowed-out ghost hovering near the galley. I walked to the center of the room and released a long, incredibly tired sigh. "I cannot authorize a physical cash withdrawal of that magnitude at this hour," I said, my voice deliberately flat and drained of all resistance. "The banking infrastructure simply does not allow for a sudden dispersal of hundreds of thousands of dollars in the middle of the night. Attempting to pull that much physical currency would immediately trigger automated federal holds and suspicious activity reports." Calvin's face instantly hardened, a prominent vein pulsing visibly against his temple. His mouth opened to unleash a torrent of rehearsed anger, but I quickly raised both of my hands in a placating, submissive gesture. "However," I continued, smoothing my expression into a mask of mild, cooperative compliance, "I can absolutely process this capital injection as an internal corporate bridge transaction. It is precisely how my logistics firm handles immediate, catastrophic liquidity crises for our high-net-worth shipping clients. It is incredibly fast, completely clean, and highly tax-advantaged." The specific phrase describing tax advantages worked like an absolute, undeniable charm. Lorraine's rigid, defensive posture instantly melted away. She did not care about the intricate legal mechanics, the morality of the situation, or the staggering danger Grant had placed them in. She only cared about the aesthetic of winning. To her deeply superficial mind, beating the system and securing a financial loophole was the ultimate, undisputed country club victory. She smiled, a brittle, triumphant curving of her perfectly painted lips, and settled comfortably back into the plush leather cushions of the sofa. I walked slowly over to the custom, climate-controlled Galley Island. Instead of reaching for the harsh, aggressive single malt scotch they had been drinking earlier, I deliberately selected a chilled bottle of vintage French champagne. I did not want them heavily intoxicated or sloppy. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted to actively cultivate a luxurious, celebratory climate that would completely dull their defensive instincts. A touch of elegant alcohol would make the heavy, complex legal jargon of the impending paperwork seem like a trivial, boring formality meant only for the hired help. I popped the cork with a soft, controlled sigh and poured 3 crystal flutes, handing them out one by one. The effervescent golden liquid caught the warm, amber cabin lights, projecting an illusion of safety. Next, I retrieved my encrypted smartphone from my jacket pocket and walked over to the polished mahogany console positioned at the edge of the seating area. I propped the device carefully against a heavy brass navigational compass, ensuring the wide-angle camera lens had a clear, entirely unobstructed view of the entire salon, specifically focusing on Calvin. I tapped the screen, a small red recording indicator light blinking to life in the dim room. Calvin narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening noticeably on the delicate stem of his crystal flute. "What exactly are you doing with that device?" he demanded, a brief flash of genuine suspicion penetrating his thick fog of arrogance. "It is a strict, non-negotiable compliance policy for Seawick Marine Logistics," I lied smoothly, maintaining steady, bored eye contact. "Any internal corporate disbursement exceeding $10,000 requires a recorded verbal authorization from all involved parties. It is a standard protective measure designed solely to insulate my company from hostile federal tax audits and corporate compliance reviews. If I am quietly funneling corporate capital to solve a personal family crisis, I absolutely must generate an airtight digital paper trail to satisfy my accounting department. Otherwise, the IRS will classify the funds as an illegal dividend." The heavily bureaucratic explanation perfectly stroked his massive, incredibly fragile ego. Calvin practically beamed with pride. He absolutely loved the idea that I was successfully manipulating sophisticated corporate loopholes specifically to serve his needs. He straightened his expensive linen jacket, puffed out his chest, and leaned forward slightly, visibly eager to demonstrate his supreme business acumen for the digital record. He wanted to look like the undisputed, highly intelligent patriarch, commanding his loyal financial empire. I stood securely behind the marble island, adopting the clinical, emotionally detached tone of a third-party auditor. "For the official corporate record," I began, looking directly at my father, "I need you to explicitly verify the exact parameters of this financial emergency. Please state for the record that this immediate debt burden belongs exclusively to Grant, and confirm that the family currently lacks the necessary liquid capital to satisfy the creditor." Calvin nodded solemnly, taking a confident, lingering sip of his champagne. He stated his absolute agreement, his voice echoing with manufactured authority. I pressed forward, maintaining a perfectly neutral facial expression while laying the final, crucial piece of the psychological snare. "Furthermore, my accountants will need to establish a clear historical precedent for this type of complex intra-family financial maneuvering to justify the risk. Can you please confirm for the record that there have been prior instances where family funds or personal credit lines associated with family members were utilized to mitigate similar liabilities?" I held my breath, my fingernails digging sharply into the palms of my hands hidden below the counter. It was the absolute edge of the blade. If he sensed the trap, if he realized I was cornering him into a legally binding admission of guilt, the entire structure would instantly collapse, but his profound arrogance served as a blinding, impenetrable shield against his own self-preservation. Calvin looked straight into the camera lens, completely and utterly unaware that he was staring down the barrel of a fully loaded legal weapon. He cleared his throat, adopted a tone of benevolent, long-suffering paternal wisdom, and unconsciously began to narrate the exact, detailed history of how they had systematically hijacked my identity, utilized my signature, and drained my credit to fund their extravagant delusions years ago. He spoke with immense pride, detailing his past financial crimes as if they were brilliant strategic maneuvers. effectively handing me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy him. I retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder from the secure drawer beneath the helm station and carried it back to the glass coffee table. I dropped it softly in front of my father. Stamped across the crisp white cover page in bold, unassuming black ink were the words, "Bridge Loan Packet." It sounded incredibly sterile, completely harmless, and perfectly routine. In reality, it was a highly weaponized legal structure constructed from 3 distinct, lethal layers. The first layer was a standard promissory note, outlining the exact principal balance required to satisfy the Northwind Capital Solutions demand, along with an aggressive, albeit legal, interest rate. The second layer was a commercial deed of trust. This specific document effectively placed a secondary, heavily restrictive lien directly against the Irvine estate. The third and final layer was an acknowledgement of historical facts, a sworn affidavit confirming the precise narrative my father was currently reciting to the camera lens. I handed a heavy brass pen to Calvin. I kept my voice entirely level, projecting the bored annoyance of a corporate executive forced to do paperwork at midnight. "This is a strict formality for my internal accounting department," I lied smoothly, tapping the top page with my index finger. "If I simply wire hundreds of thousands of dollars to an offshore collection agency on your behalf, the federal government will instantly classify it as an unearned gift. The resulting tax penalties would absolutely cripple my operating budget for the next 3 fiscal quarters. By signing this packet, we establish a clean, documented loan. You are legally acknowledging the debt, which protects my company from an audit." I casually flipped to the third page, pointing to a dense block of minimized text buried deep within the standard boilerplate language. "There is a standard cross-default and misrepresentation clause," I explained, intentionally making it sound like the most tedious paragraph in the world. It simply states that if the borrower intentionally conceals material facts, or if the underlying collateral is already in a state of default, this bridge loan is automatically accelerated. It means the lender can immediately recall the funds. Standard corporate protection. Just initial the bottom right corner. It was the absolute linchpin of the entire trap. By signing that specific clause, they were legally affirming that the house was in good standing. But I already knew, thanks to Darlene's rapid investigation, that Northwind had already filed a public notice of default. The very second Calvin's pen touched the paper, he would be committing documented, undeniable contractual fraud. The trap would snap shut instantly, granting my holding company the absolute, unquestionable legal authority to seize the asset without enduring a lengthy court battle. Calvin barely glanced at the dense paragraphs. His attention was completely captivated by the glowing red recording light on my smartphone. He was still actively performing for the imaginary board of directors he thought he was impressing. I leaned forward slightly, gesturing for him to continue his previous train of thought. "You were explaining the historical precedent for the accounting record," I prompted softly. "To prove this is a standard family practice," Calvin puffed out his chest, leaning back into the leather sofa with an air of absolute, unchallenged superiority. He looked directly into the lens. "Money under my roof is shared money," Calvin declared, his voice booming with toxic, paternal arrogance. "There is no such thing as individual wealth when the family reputation requires protection. Back then, when Grant needed immediate liquidity for his initial ventures, I used your funds the exact same way. I leveraged your credit profile because you were living under my name. It was not theft. It was simply managing the household portfolio, the same way we are managing this minor turbulence tonight." I kept my facial muscles completely frozen. I did not blink. I did not let a single ounce of the searing, white-hot rage burning in my chest bleed through my carefully constructed mask. I did not need his tearful apologies. I did not need his remorse. I only needed that exact, legally binding verbal confession immortalized on a digital server. I slid the brass pen across the smooth glass surface. Grant moved first. He practically lunged across the table, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. He scrawled his signature across the borrower line with frantic, desperate strokes, tearing the surface of the heavy paper. In his exhausted, terrified mind, He genuinely believed that applying ink to this document would magically erase the violent men hunting him in the dark. He thought signing it meant he was finally safe. Lorraine took the pen next. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting nervously toward the words, "Deed of Trust." But the crushing, suffocating fear of public humiliation, of losing her pristine suburban palace to a bank auction, completely overpowered her minimal reading comprehension. She signed her name with her usual sweeping, elegant loops, completely unaware she was actively locking the chains around her own wrists. Finally, Calvin took the pen. He did not read a single sentence. He did not ask a single clarifying question. He signed the documents with heavy, authoritative strokes because he was entirely blinded by his own narcissism. He was absolutely confident that I was still the desperate, discarded daughter desperately craving his validation. He believed I was finally submitting to my proper role in his hierarchy. He believed he had won. He handed the pen back to me with a smug, self-satisfied nod. Just as my fingers closed around the cold brass, my phone vibrated silently against the mahogany console. Just outside the camera's view, a brief notification flashed across the locked screen. It was a secure text message from Darlene. The message was incredibly brief and flawlessly executed. It confirmed that the hostile negotiation was complete. Northwind Capital Solutions had aggressively accepted our immediate cash offer. They had officially sold the principal debt at a massive discount to avoid the impending legal friction. The digital transfer was already processing. The assignment of the note was complete. Turner Holdco Limited Liability Company was now the exclusive, undisputed owner of their catastrophic debt. I reached over and tapped the screen of my recording device, turning off the red light. The sudden absence of the recording indicator shifted the energy in the room instantly. The performance was over. I carefully gathered the 3 layers of the signed bridge loan packet. I tapped the edges of the heavy bond paper against the glass table to align them perfectly, then slid the entire stack seamlessly into my black leather briefcase. I snapped the twin brass lock shut. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet salon, sounding exactly like a heavy steel vault sealing shut permanently. I looked up. I looked at Grant's sweaty, relieved face. I looked at Lorraine's relaxed posture. I looked at Calvin's arrogant, victorious smirk. For the very first time in over 1,000 days, I allowed a genuine, completely unmasked smile to spread slowly across my face. "It is done," I said. Calvin leaned aggressively across the glass table, his palm extended entirely upward. The thick gold band of his expensive watch caught the warm overhead light. He squared his shoulders, adopting the demanding, thoroughly arrogant posture of a king who had finally arrived to collect his overdue taxes. "All right," he commanded, his voice dripping with heavy, condescending expectation. "The paperwork is finalized. Where's the cash?" I looked down at his outstretched hand, studying the smooth, uncalloused skin, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his intense gaze. The heavy, suffocating silence in the salon stretched out for 5 agonizing seconds. I did not move toward the safe. I did not reach for my bag. "I did not pay your debt, Calvin," I said, my voice as calm, flat, and absolute as a frozen lake. "I bought it," he frowned heavily, his outstretched hand faltering slightly as his brain struggled to process the fundamental shift in my vocabulary. "What on earth are you talking about?" I picked up my smartphone, unlocked the screen, and opened my secure corporate email application. I rotated the device and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany surface until it rested precisely in front of him. "That is an official, legally binding confirmation of assignment," I stated, clasping my hands loosely behind my back. "As of 3 minutes ago, Northwind Capital Solutions no longer holds the promissory note attached to the Irvine estate. They happily sold the debt at a massive discount to a newly formed corporate entity named Turner Holdco Limited Liability Company. I am the sole managing director and the exclusive owner of that holding company. Therefore, I am your new creditor." Calvin leaned forward, his eyes scanning the brightly illuminated text on the screen. The healthy, confident color drained completely from his face, replaced in a fraction of a second by a violently mottled, dark red flush of sheer panic. He slammed his closed fist down onto the table, the impact rattling the crystal champagne flutes and sending a splash of golden liquid across the glass. "You manipulative little liar," he spat, his sophisticated, patriarchal veneer shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Are you planning to foreclose on my house? Are you going to throw your own parents out onto the street?" "I am absolutely not going to do anything outside the strict, predefined boundaries of a standard commercial contract," I replied, holding my ground without stepping back. "I am simply going to execute the exact same legal rights that Northwind was preparing to deploy against you by early next week. I am just going to execute the procedure with significantly less vulgarity and far more efficiency." Lorraine let out a sharp, high-pitched gasp that echoed harshly in the confined space. The terrifying reality of the situation finally pierced straight through her thick, lifelong armor of deliberate ignorance. She practically threw herself forward onto the edge of the leather sofa, her perfectly manicured hands grasping desperately at the empty air between us. "Stella, please, you cannot possibly do this," Lorraine wailed, all pretense of elegance entirely abandoning her. "We are your family. That is our home. You have to cancel this transaction immediately." Grant stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His knees hit the edge of the galley island, and he slumped heavily against the cold marble countertop. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. As he stared at me, I watched the exact moment his mind finally comprehended the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the arena he had dragged them all into. In the high-stakes realm of corporate finance, there are no brothers, there are no parents, there is no blood, there are only heavily leveraged assets and ironclad liabilities. "It gets significantly worse," I stated, raising my voice just enough to cut cleanly through Lorraine's hysterical weeping. I tapped the toe of my heavy work boot against the black leather briefcase resting securely on the carpet. "You just signed an acknowledgement clause verifying the exact material condition of the collateral. You legally affirmed in writing that the house was in perfect standing, but Northwind had already filed a public notice of default 4 months ago. The very second you applied ink to that specific paper, you committed documented contractual fraud. That explicit violation triggers an automatic, non-negotiable acceleration of the entire principal balance." I paused, letting the crushing, suffocating weight of the legal snare settle heavily over their shoulders. "Furthermore," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, authoritative register, "the video recording I just secured on this device contains your explicit, highly detailed, and entirely voluntary confession. You proudly narrated exactly how you hijacked my credit profile and forged financial documents 3 years ago. Combined with the bizarrely hesitant signature Lorraine left on the original deed of trust, I now possess absolutely irrefutable, digital evidence of systematic financial crimes. This is no longer a sad, private family dispute over money. It is a highly actionable federal offense," Calvin roared, a primal, guttural sound of absolute, humiliated rage. He lunged his entire body weight across the coffee table, his large hands swiping violently toward my smartphone. I did not even flinch or pull away. I simply snatched the device off the table an inch before his fingers could grasp it, letting his hands slap uselessly against the hard glass surface. "Do not embarrass yourself any further," I warned, stepping slightly to the side. "The high-definition video file and the digital contract scans have already automatically synchronized to a secure, encrypted corporate server located entirely out of your physical reach. Destroying this piece of plastic will accomplish absolutely nothing." I turned my back on his furious, heavy breathing and pressed the dedicated intercom button bolted securely to the bulkhead. "Engine room, this is the captain. Spin up the main drives. Prepare to detach from shore power." I then pulled a heavy handheld radio from its charging cradle and tuned it directly to the local security frequency. "Newport Harbor Security. This is the commercial vessel Seawick. I currently have 3 unauthorized individuals actively trespassing on my deck. They are becoming hostile and refusing to leave. I require an immediate escort to remove them from my commercial property." Grant pushed himself off the marble counter, his face completely devoid of color. He looked exactly like a man standing on the edge of the gallows, staring down at the long drop. "Stella," Grant whispered, his voice cracking horribly, stripping away decades of arrogant mockery. "Do you want to kill me? Is that what this is all about? Are you truly trying to destroy my life?" I looked at my brother, searching myself for any lingering trace of sibling affection, any tiny spark of pity. The well had run completely dry 36 months ago. "No, Grant," I said quietly, the words carrying the heavy, undisputed finality of a closing steel vault door. "I do not want to kill you. I just want you to pay." The heavy rhythmic thrum of the twin diesel engines vibrated powerfully through the floorboards, a strong, steady heartbeat coming to life beneath our feet. Through the tinted starboard windows, the flashing yellow lights of a harbor patrol boat cut sharply through the darkness, pulling rapidly alongside the concrete dock. Calvin stood completely frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving aggressively, his fists clenched tight at his sides. Lorraine was sobbing uncontrollably, burying her face into her expensive silk scarf. Grant was staring completely blankly at the floor. They were finally entirely out of moves. They had been completely stripped of their unearned power, exposed, outmaneuvered, and utterly defeated in the exact arena they mistakenly thought they controlled. 2 armed security officers boarded the aft deck, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the teak. I slid the thick glass door open and stepped aside. I did not say another single word, nor did I offer a final glance as the uniformed men firmly directed my family off my vessel. I walked out onto the cold deck and watched them trudge slowly up the long concrete dock, their massive, incredibly expensive suitcases rolled awkwardly behind them. They looked incredibly small, entirely fragile, and utterly pathetic under the harsh amber streetlights. I signaled the dockhand, and the heavy mooring ropes were cast off, splashing heavily into the dark water. I pushed the dual throttles forward. The massive yacht separated from the dock with a smooth, powerful grace, gliding silently out toward the open, black channel. The lights of the harbor slowly faded into the distance, slipping quietly away into the night like the final, echoing notes of a definitively closed chapter. By the time the sun fully crested over the Pacific Ocean the following morning, Darlene had already executed the legal strike. She recorded the assignment with the county clerk and issued an acceleration demand for immediate debt restructuring under the authority of my new holding company, was dispatched via certified overnight courier directly to their pristine suburban doorstep. Calvin, entirely predictable in his narcissistic panic, immediately resorted to playing the only card he believed he had left: public family manipulation. He took to various social media platforms, posting long, aggressively unhinged paragraphs about how his ungrateful, heartless daughter had maliciously stolen the family home out from under them. He painted himself as a tragic martyr bleeding for his children. I did not respond to a single post. I did not issue a public defense. I answered his loud, desperate digital tantrums with absolute, suffocating silence whenever he attempted to escalate the public smear campaign. My corporate legal team simply responded by filing another heavily documented motion with the court. Here is the ultimate, unspoken truth that my parents completely failed to grasp. During those 36 months of radio silence, I had not merely been surviving in the shadows. I had been actively, meticulously fortifying my entire existence. I had spent countless hours cleaning my credit, separating my corporate entities, establishing blind trusts, and erecting impenetrable liability shields. I did all of this because I knew, with absolute certainty, that the day would eventually come when they ran out of other people's money. I had spent 3 years preparing the exact legal battlefield for the specific day they finally tracked down my yacht. 6 weeks later, we all sat in a sterile, heavily air-conditioned mediation room in downtown Los Angeles. The heavy mahogany table dividing us felt like a massive continental fault line. This was the exact moment Calvin truly realized the profound, terrifying nature of his defeat. He walked into that room dressed in his finest tailored suit, fully prepared to argue with a stubborn, emotional daughter. He expected tears, raised voices, and the messy, chaotic entanglement of family trauma. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a completely detached, unyielding corporate creditor. I did not look at him with anger. I looked at him the exact same way I looked at a severely depreciated shipping container. The binding terms I laid out through Darlene were completely devoid of mercy, yet strictly bound by the letter of the law. The Irvin estate was to be immediately listed for sale, or they could attempt to secure a high-interest refinancing plan if they somehow found a lender reckless enough to take them on. The proceeds from the transaction were heavily prioritized. My holding company would be paid the exact principal of the original loan first, followed immediately by all accumulated legal fees. Most importantly, I legally mandated full financial restitution for the exact dollar amount they had fraudulently drained from my personal credit lines years ago. A figure now backed by irrefutable digital evidence and their own recorded confessions, Grant did not escape the blast radius to satisfy his portion of the shared liability. He was placed under a strict, court-ordered civil income garnishment plan that would last for the next 10 years. It was not designed to completely destroy his life or leave him destitute. It was simply the rigid, undeniable enforcement of consequences. It was the absolute end of his lifelong cycle of utilizing my resources to artificially inflate his own existence. As my lawyers slid the final settlement agreement across the polished table, Lorraine finally broke her stoic facade. She looked down at her trembling hands, her expensive diamond rings suddenly looking incredibly heavy and entirely worthless. "I knew," Lorraine whispered, her voice barely carrying across the silent room. "When your father took those credit cards in your name years ago, I knew exactly what he was doing, but I stayed silent. I am so sorry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for a story. I just gave a brief, clinical nod, acknowledging her confession as if she had just confirmed a highly irrelevant, severely delayed shipping manifest. The apology was 36 months too late, and it held absolutely zero currency in this room. Calvin, realizing that his wife had surrendered and his son was broken, made one final, desperate play. He leaned across the table, his eyes wide, stripping away the last remnants of his pride. "Stella, please," Calvin begged, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated fear. "Just give me a chance. Give us one more chance to make this right as a family." I looked directly into his desperate eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. "I gave you a chance, Calvin," I replied, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls of the conference room. "I gave you 3 full years. You used every single second of it to erase me." I stood up, buttoned my tailored jacket, and walked out of the room without looking back. That evening, I stood completely alone on the upper deck of my yacht. The vessel was anchored peacefully in a secluded cove, miles away from the noise of the city. The dark, endless expanse of the ocean stretched out before me, reflecting the cold, brilliant light of the moon. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened my contact list. With 3 deliberate, unhesitating taps, I permanently deleted Calvin, Lorraine, and Grant from my device. There was no burning hatred left in my chest. There was no lingering sorrow. There was only the profound, incredibly light sensation of a heavily audited ledger finally being balanced and closed. I breathed in the crisp, salty air, feeling the gentle, rhythmic sway of the deck beneath my boots. Family is not a place where you are charged interest. From today on, I stopped paying fees to exist. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know exactly where in the world you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts on this situation. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video and support the channel even further by hit the notification bell so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.